Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this webinar, the Triple Dividend of Resilience from Concept to Application. Very pleased to have you all to join us for this exciting discussion. For the last at least 10 years, many of us have been thinking about the incentives for investing in disaster risk reduction and adaptation and how to improve those incentives. And I guess we had a breakthrough in about 2015 with the concept and framework of the Triple Dividend of Resilience, which ODI worked on with LSE and the World Bank. And this is an opportunity to take that concept further and present and discuss some of the research that's been done applying the framework to see what the results are. So we have an exciting lineup of presenters and speakers today. Before I introduce them, just a few points of housekeeping. The session is being recorded, so you'll get a copy of that recording afterwards, as well as a transcript of the Q&A. All of the participants, attendees are on mute, but you can use the Q&A box to write your questions and observations, and I encourage you to do so as you are listening to the speakers. You can vote on the questions if you see another question that you like, and comment on other people's questions. At the end of the panel, the panelists will be able to respond to your questions live, and we have allowed plenty of time for that discussion at the end, so we'll have at least 30 minutes for panelists to respond to your questions and to have a discussion about them at the end. So now to the introductions. We'll have two introductions from one from Svenja Szyminski from the LSE, who will introduce everyone to the Triple Dividend of Resilience framework. And then Carter Brandon from WRI is going to tell us a bit about how the framework has been used in calculating global benefits of adaptation. And then we have a panel with of 4 presentations. One from me, I'll be back later. Victor Rosen from LSE, Tom Tanner from SOAS, and Uli Volts from SOAS. And after those presentations, there will be a Q&A session. So please get your questions ready, put them in the Q&A box, and we should be able to respond to all of them. So let me hand over now to Svenja, who's going to give us an introduction on the Triple Dividend of Resilience framework. Thanks.
Yeah, hi, Emily, many thanks for this, and hello to everybody on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to just give you a very quick sort of introduction overview of, what the Triple Resilient Dividend is, and, just to sort of, make sure that we are all on the same page and can sort of go a little bit into the case studies to understand how we're applying it. Before I do that, I just would like to extend also my welcome on behalf of the Zurich Threat Resilience Alliance, which we are a member of, which is kind of an alliance that brings together NGOs, the private sector, and research. And we all share a passion for resilience, and we are all determined to support the business case for resilience. We work with communities across the world to sort of take a holistic approach of resilience, understanding the different drivers and determinants. And the reason that we are actually so excited about this webinar is because it sort of fits in very much with our work that we are currently doing across some of our communities, where we're actually taking the Triple Resilient Dividend into those communities and use that to understand, to create narratives, to help sort of monitor resilience at the local level. So, well, what is then the Triple Resilient Dividend? And yeah, as Emily said, this is now, this goes back to 2015 when, I was part of a team with ODI and the World Bank, where we basically started with, sort of the exam question, we know that there is actually a very strong case for resilience, and we have good, cost-benefit analysis, but it is insufficient to convince, particularly Ministry of Finance, but also in the private sector decision makers, to really see resilience as an investment. So we looked at this long and hard, and my background is political science as well as economics, and I think there's also an understanding of what is the political economy here, what actually is needed to see resilience as an investment and treat it as such, and not just see it as a cost. And also in particular, point out that there are benefits to be gained from resilience, regardless of whether you're going to be hit by an event or not. So that's kind of really the starting point for our work on this concept. And what it led to was this idea that there's a business case for resilience, and it demonstrates the benefits of resilience along 3 different dimensions. One is avoided losses, the next one is development dividend, and then co-benefits. And I just, this is kind of, you might be familiar, there's a publication that we put out to just summarize that concept here. So, you see the first dividend, that's very much the sort of traditional view, why do we need resilience? We need resilience to avoid losses. And obviously that is kind of the main driving force behind, a lot of efforts in the resilience space. But we say it doesn't stop there. And actually that's only part of the story, because, if you do invest in resilience, and if you take measures to support resilience, you can also help unlock economic potential. And that's the second dividend. So this is almost like an economic stimulus that can come through resilience by increasing investment, by sort of making some areas actually valid for investment, because you're increasing their resilience, so they become valid for investment, but also stimulating productivity and also fiscal stability and access to credit. So that's kind of that second block, which we call, the development dividend, or unlocking economic potential. And then the third one, that is really the one that, sort of under the banner of co-benefits, that looks at a much wider range of, potential wins that you can create through resilient investment. This could be in terms of ecosystem services, transportation use, agriculture gains, but also social aspects. I mean, a lot of our work in communities also looks at social cohesion, how investments can have benefits in terms of education, in terms of, also health, but also in terms of just social, community life. So that's what we call the third dividend, which sort of looks at these co-benefits. And of course, we're talking about benefits. There are also costs attached to resilience, of course, and we need to also understand those. But I guess what we're trying to do with this framework, and you will hear today about these applications and what we've learned from that, is really to change the narrative and to have a really strong case of, understanding resilience as an investment and not as a cost. So I'll leave it here, and hopefully this will, sort of give you a good grounding of the concept, and then we'll sort of do some deep dives into understanding the knowledge that comes out of our case studies. With that, I would like to pass over to Carter Brandon, who actually was involved in the very early discussions and the conceptual work here. So it's a pleasure to continue our collaboration on this. I'll stop my screen sharing and pass over to you, Carter.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Svena, and good to see everybody. And as Svena said, we did kick around this idea a few years ago, and I was very happy as part of the Global Commission on Adaptation to help keep this going at a very macro level. So let me share my slides quickly to give some overview on that Global Commission on Adaptation. Here we go. Hopefully that's worked. So I'm at World Resources Institute, but we've been supporting the Global Commission on Adaptation, which was a group of high-level people. As you can see, the three co-chairs were Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, who now runs the IMF. And the objective was to give a boost to adaptation. You know, for a long time, people felt that adaptation was a second order priority because it would excuse countries and corporations from taking steps to mitigate climate change. But now we realize that climate change is upon us and we have to take action in a way, and it doesn't actually reduce from the incentive for mitigation. In my view, it boosts it because it makes the full cost of adaptation apparent, and it shows that mitigation is in fact the cheaper and the most essential way to go forward. But anyway, so this group was looking for ways to boost arguments for adaptation. And the way it's structured its conclusions was to say, we need some revolutions in how we think and understand the problem of climate change. And on the left-hand side, you basically see that our entire report, which came out a year ago, says that we need a revolution in understanding, and then understanding risk, understanding costs, understanding benefits. Then we need to use that information in planning to understand when we use policies, when we do investments, when we do promote behavior change, all kinds of things. And then third, we need money. So those are the three broad themes that we applied to different sectors. Now, what I want to show to you all is the triple dividends is really part of the theory of change for how we bring about expanded adaptation effort, because it's essential to understanding the problem to go beyond what Sveina said, the avoided losses, into the other benefits of investment. And it's essential to doing detailed planning. There's two things that Sveina said that I want to bring out. One, it is based in a cost benefit framework, and it is a long tradition of understanding costs and benefits. And there's nothing, you know, essentially radical about triple dividends. It's just a way to show that we have underestimated the benefits of action. And the second thing she said was that the benefits can accrue whether or not, let me go to this one, whether or not the event that you're trying to avoid losses from, such as a storm perhaps or a flood, the benefits accrue whether or not that happens. They accrue regardless, and they also accrue sooner. And so we can capture this in the cost benefit framework. So this is a graphic from the report done by the Global Commission. It basically summarizes exactly what Sveina just said. We applied this to the various sectors. We had concrete examples, such as in infrastructure, such as in nature, such as in agriculture. And then we did some empirical work, and I will come to that here. So we showed, and this was one of the most highly cited figures and empirical conclusions from the work of the Commission, where we actually showed that the rate of return is huge. And this shows that in these 5 sectors, early warning systems, infrastructure, dryland agriculture and crop protection, coastal mangroves, and water resources management, in these 5 broad areas, that if the world collectively invested close to $2 trillion, we did a calculation of about 1.8. This was not the total required. This was sort of the, what's called a good start. If we invested 1.8 trillion over the next 10 years, the benefits would be almost 5 times higher, $7 trillion. And this rate of return on investing in adaptation was one of the most highly cited figures. And you can see, in particularly in early warning systems, the benefits were off the charts. The costs are relatively low. The benefits from avoided death, for example, think of countries like Bangladesh, have been enormous. Bangladesh, for the similar strength storm in the 70s, may have lost 200,000 people. Same strength storm, now they might lose 5 people. It's fantastic progress because of early warning, and also because of making infrastructure resilient, supporting pre-storm protocols and retreat routes and shelters, but then also post storm recovery systems, safety nets, etc. The costs have just come down to very, very little, and the rate of return is high. So the way we did this broad analysis was 100% literature review. There's no new studies. If we had an army of graduate students, I would love to go through World Bank and other MDB appraisal reports and look at the economic costs and benefits, financing costs and benefits, and really tease out better analysis. And I'm looking forward to the case studies today. But we did a literature review, and we did, it's very fairly systematic to get these rates of returns from a widespread number of investments. I just want to relate this back to the triple dividends framework, where we've got those 5 areas that we did the empirical analysis. And then we have the 3 components of the triple dividends: the avoided losses, the induced economic benefits, and then the non-market social environmental benefits. In the literature, because this is a new systematic approach we'd like to adopt, we didn't find that it has been systematically adopted yet. It is a new approach to be systematic. What the World Bank often does is shows that the rate of return on a certain investment is adequate. It doesn't, once it's shown that it's above 10%, it doesn't have to go to value other induced benefits or social and economic benefits to show that the rate of return isn't really 10 or 12%. It's actually 30 or 40 or 50%. It doesn't have to do that, so it doesn't. But going back to our theory of change, if we are in a situation where the investments are not being made, but these calculations would make a difference, then we need to do that. We need to do that within the donor community, and we need to do that within ministries of planning and other line ministries in developing countries who need to understand the risk and understand the benefits of doing more about it, given that the risks are increasingly upon us. I do want to say that this concept is alive and well at the World Bank. This is actually a slide that's only 3 days old. We had a review meeting because I was at the World Bank for 20 years. I was invited to be a reviewer of a major study in Turkey on green growth. And so what I've titled this slide, obviously you can't read the details now, but the triple dividends concept, because it's embedded in cost benefit, there's nothing unique to using it for resilience. It's a good place to start because resilience is underinvested, but you can use it for other concepts more broadly. And the World Bank is using it now for investments in Turkey for green growth. What's particularly exciting about this study in Turkey is it's involving 30 people. It's involving the entire World Bank spectrum of sectoral specialists. It's not just the environment community, it's not just the infrastructure community, it's the macro community and the poverty community and the health community that's coming together to say, we are going to make this a flagship study in Turkey. We want to understand everything that's going on and how to make the case. And you've all heard about the Build Back Better motto. In the case of the pandemic stimulus, we need to build back green stimulus incentives for the longer term. This is in fact that approach for Turkey. And I put number 1, 2, 3 along the left-hand side because these are the categories. There's the category number 1, the direct immediate investments that are being made in green, but then there's the accelerated GDP growth, which is more the induced economic benefits, and then there's the non-market economic co-benefits. So this framework is alive and well at the World Bank, which is, I think, a powerful endorsement of what we're trying to do. Just quickly, I'm going to show you that I want to go back to this slide where we talked about this concept is important for understanding and planning. And now I will make the case that it's important for finance too, because if you don't have good appraisal, good economic analysis, good financial analysis, you won't get the money. It's a competitive world. There's scarce resources. There's the pandemic, of course, has put resources in many directions we didn't plan on a year ago. Climate change community is thinking maybe we don't have as much as we need. The environment community is thinking that. So you have to make the case. So this methodology helps do that. What, in my last slide I want to conclude is to say, it's not just for the public sector, it's also for the private sector. To scale up investment, governments, donors, everybody have long concluded that the public sector doesn't have all the money it needs. It needs to attract private finance in infrastructure, it needs to attract private finance in agriculture, in water, even in resilience like early warning systems. So we need to map out the costs and benefits of those kinds of investments. And so we can use this framework to map out what are the private costs, what are the public costs, what are the private benefits, what are the public benefits, and you can do a matrix. So again, I won't go into details, but this is a matrix. And the sweet spot to actually promote blended finance, which is the goal to get more money flowing in joint public and private operations, is to find those operations where there are joint costs, joint benefits, and then you can tease out in the cost sharing, risk sharing, deal-making process, how to work out the details. But you've already established the basis for making these investments. So I'd like to conclude by saying the triple dividends concept is fundamental. It addresses everything that the Commission has supported to scale up resilience investments across understanding, planning, finance, across sectors. We have delighted to lay it out. We've delighted to act on it, and delighted to see this seminar, bringing these concepts to you and taking it forward. Thank you. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you very much, Carter. Now I'm going to make a short presentation about a study that was undertaken to explore the resilience dividends of investment and improvement in early warning systems. I'm going to talk very briefly about the findings of a study that was conducted as part of the WISER Transform project, which is sponsoring the webinar today. WISER is the Weather and Climate Services for Africa program. It's a major UK government funded initiative that aims to transform the delivery of weather and climate services and improving that delivery and uptake and use of climate and weather information. And in this study, we wanted to look very explicitly at the benefits associated with early warning systems in Tanzania, where there had been, one of the WISER projects had been implemented. So the focus is really on early warning systems, which is one of the sectors that Carter highlighted in his introduction. And we use the triple dividend framework to explore these benefits in more depth, to look not just at the kind of direct and anticipated benefits, but the indirect benefits of having better information about the weather and extreme events in particular. Next slide, please. So the study looks at the multi-hazard early warning service project, which was implemented by the Tanzania Met Authority and the UK Met Office from 2016 to 2018. And the project made sort of a major investment in improving the dissemination and understanding of information about extreme weather using pictorial symbols, color-coded warnings for different levels of alert. And also conducted a lot of kind of workshops and trainings for journalists and local government and others that would be disseminating information with communities. The service was launched in 2018 in coastal areas, and there was so successful that it's being rolled out nationwide. But I want to highlight here that it's not kind of the only investment or initiative in early warning systems. It very much builds on others, and there were lots of other things going on in Tanzania before and during this initiative. So the aim was not really just to evaluate how well this project did, but to look more broadly at the benefits of having better weather information. Next slide, please. So here we can see a graph of disasters in Tanzania, and particularly in coastal areas. And we thought that for this study, it would be interesting to focus specifically on coastal areas and on the activities of fishing communities as a sector, maybe that hadn't been looked at in so much detail in terms of how people use early warning system. There's been a lot of focus on agriculture, and as this project was particularly focused on the coastal areas initially, we thought this was a good opportunity to really to look at some of the impacts on the ground. Fisheries are particularly important in Tanzania and provide export revenue and account for 35% of rural employment. And it is a sector that has become more frequently affected by coastal flooding since around 2007, although that could be due to the records not being as good before that point in time. But we see an increase in the number of kind of disasters affecting coastal areas from about that time onwards. Next slide, please. So now to the findings of the study. So we conducted some key informant interviews and focus group discussions in a number of coastal communities in Tanzania. And the first thing to say is that people evaluated the project really well in terms of their understanding of the messages and having kind of being more appreciative of the better information, not just about extreme weather, but day-to-day information about the weather that they found useful. There was a feeling that people were able to take more precautionary measures when they had better information, to make some small adjustments, fixing roofs and doors, repairing and maintaining their equipment, refraining from going fishing and relocating fish freezers and coolers when heavy rainfall is likely. So they were doing a number of things when they had better information that helped reduce some of the impacts. And there was a perception that the human impacts, at least, and also on property, some people mentioned, of extreme weather had reduced on the coast. Now the graph reflects a reduction in human impacts. We're not saying that it's related directly to this project alone. As I said, there were a lot of things going on at the time, and we didn't have enough information or as detailed information from TMA to really be able to draw a kind of relationship between the having information and avoided losses. But there does seem to be, there was an indication from our focus group discussions that was the case, and this is certainly worthy of further exploration. Next slide, please. So for the second dividend of resilience, again, from the key informant interviews and focus group discussions, it was reported that some fishermen were able to buy new fishing gear and motorboats and switch to better vessels. So they were some of them were able to take actions to kind of upgrade and improve their fishing activities. Some were engaging in new activities like water sports, tourism, but I think overall the main observation here was that these improvements in investment were not widespread, so not very many people were able to take those kind of positive risks associated with the second resilience dividend. On the third dividend, so these co-benefits, one interviewee noted that organised training community meetings had helped to strengthen relationships between community members and their leaders. So, and that was noted in a couple of the focus group discussions as well, that the training that was provided and the interactions around the alert levels and explaining how the early warning system worked was kind of good for community relationships. That communities were participating in these activities and to some extent were better organised as a result. So we're seeing some kind of improvements around collective action as a result of being engaged in these activities. And I think perhaps one of the most interesting findings of this study was that households were able to plan better as a result of having this information. So they can both plan better in terms of their fishing activities, knowing when they can go out further and for longer, that when they won't be affected by adverse weather, but also conversely, they can switch to other income generating activities when there is an alert. So going into sort of trade buying and selling fish in the local markets rather than going out to sea. So that was an important co-benefit. And the last slide, please. So just to finish, it was important to note really in the study, and this is a qualitative study based on interviews, as I said, that what was interesting about it is that it really is, risk is only one of the kind of obstacles stopping people from investing more in more profitable activities and taking the kind of risks that are necessary to increase the productivity and increase their earnings. And so there are other obstacles apart from lack of information constraining that. So that's really important to bear in mind. So the early warning systems need to be complemented by other sorts of support like microfinance. And the other important point here is that the socioeconomic starting point of individuals and households is really important. So not everyone is going to be able to use information and respond to the lower risk environment by increasing their investments. So those two things I think are interesting when thinking about the second resilience dividend and how people are able to sort of use having better information about the weather, better early warning systems to make decisions about their own economic activities. So I will leave it there. I'm very happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see my slides. So what before I start, I would quickly want to introduce myself. My name is Victor Rötzer. I'm a researcher at the London School of Economics, and I'm also part of the Flood Resilience Alliance. And as part of that, I would like to present in the next few minutes our work on an analysis of a number of disaster risk reduction projects on the community level of flood and specific on flooding, and sort of like how we analyze sort of like if how like the triple dividend of resilience is realized, and also sort of like some of the caveats that come with it. I'm doing this work together with Svenja Suminski and also two colleagues from IASA, Finn Laurin and Reinhard Mechler. And what I would like to start with, just give you a quick overview on sort of which communities we've analyzed. So through our partners, both within the Flood Resilience Alliance, but also sort of outside partners, we are able to collect a number of community level measures that were implemented in total in 8 countries. These are marked in blue, mainly in Latin America and Asia. And on top of that, we also like looked in as the project, and I think that was already also mentioned. The question, sort of like the concept of like additional resilience dividends or co-benefits is not really new, but I sort of like the idea of like structuring around the 3 dividends. I think is we consider as really helpful. With that, throughout the
Victor, I don't think we can't hear you very well, or is it just me?
I think we're having some connection issues with Victor. Victor, can you hear us?
Victor, you're on mute now.
Can you hear me better now? I tried to
Yes.
switch off the video. Maybe that's better. Great. Sorry for that.
Can you start that slide again, please? Thanks.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So what we did is we tried to track the triple dividend of resilience across the different, or throughout the different steps of the decision-making cycle. So starting with sort of like the problem identification, throughout like the appraisal of the project, and then sort of like looking at the decision of like on what intervention has, or on what intervention was chosen, and then sort of like through the implementation and then the monitoring and evaluation process, looking both on one side the methodological ways on sort of like appraising the triple dividend, but also then looking at the empirical evidence and like what can we actually observe in part as part of the monitoring and evaluation on materialized dividends. And I just want to show like two quick things. Like the first thing is from our survey of like 40 community level interventions. And I think the main thing is sort of what we looked here is sort of like we looked at different types of interventions. So like agricultural on the left, capacity building and education, forecasting and early warning system, livelihoods and finance, and water management and hygiene. And so we looked at sort of what dividends were reported as part of these projects. As I mentioned before, these are not like specific triple resilient dividend projects, but they are projects that have considered additional dividends. And what we find also, like the important message from that slide is that like we couldn't find one where we would like really see like all three dividends like specifically mentioned as part of the description, and also as part of like sort of the what has been materials and what was considered in the planning. But there's at least like sort of in addition to sort of avoiding losses, there's at least one or sometimes two dividends. And I think we've even had projects where in this sample where there was not really a first dividend or avoided losses as a first order effect, but more as a second order effect throughout sort of like a better community resilience, which would then lead to the community sort of to better protect themselves, for example, as an individual. The other thing I would like to show is sort of like a deep dive into one of the case studies from like kindly shared by our partners from Practical Action, which is on Bio-dykes in Nepal. And sort of you see on the left, so the idea of Bio-dykes, if you haven't heard before, is sort of like you build a dike as a flood protection from like local materials, and then sort of like you're growing like local vegetation on top of it. And so if you start is what you see in the second picture, sort of like with protecting sort of the seeds in the beginning until sort of like the vegetation is like big enough so that the roots like sort of like stabilize the dike, and also sort of like help then to keep the water out. And what you see on the last picture is, or the one on the bottom picture is sort of like how it looks like once sort of like a few years in, and sort of like the vegetation is becoming big enough. And these bio-dykes were implemented in two communities in the Karnali River Basin, so that's in western Nepal, who were both affected by frequent river flooding as part of the monsoon. And like one main issue is sort of like that this flooding like destroys crops on agricultural areas. And the idea was to implement these bio-dykes to mainly protect the agricultural areas. There were a few dividends, mainly qualitatively considered, besides sort of like avoiding losses, were like increased agricultural yields, so like not only from like avoiding the damage, but also sort of like from using the vegetation that's growing on these dikes. Like as one effect there was hope is like lower out migration, since people like directly depend on these crops for their livelihood, and sort of like if you can maintain those, so there's the hope that this will stop out migration. There's CO2 sequestration as a third dividend benefit, and also creating new wildlife habitats in these like new green spaces that are created. 5 years into the project now, there's a few things. There have been floods where sort of like was proven that they can avoid damage. There's an increased production for livestock, for fodder for livestock through this vegetation on the dikes. And there's also new knowledge and skills, which was something that was like positively reported from the local community, which has not been really considered in the first place. And like there's a new wildlife habitat, but there's of course, like always, there's a downside. And one thing that we've looked into is sort of like, or like what Practical Action looked into and shared with us, is that that local community members and also local decision makers like remained in favor of sort of like measures such as concrete walls or like hard resilience measures, with where we have like lower additional dividends, and like one or two things that were highlighted that might be the reason for that was, one is sort of like there are like co-costs that come, and like for example the wildlife was reported that was like settling down in these areas were sort of destroying crops, which were sort of like one area conflict, because sort of like it affected the whole community versus sort of like few people benefiting from these defenses. And the other thing was also that sort of there was some conflicts about how to share the resources that growing on these dikes. And one other thing was also, there's like, since there's quite regular flooding, there was also some pressure to really deliver on the first dividend. And since this takes a bit more time than sort of like building concrete walls, I think that was sort of a concern of local decision makers, that it would not be as effective in avoiding losses. Just very quickly, my summary. I think one is a bit obvious, but I thought I would still mention it. Sort of like what we've seen from analyzing these 40 interventions is that most of them have additional dividends, like both in the second and third dividends, but there's no really silver bullet solution. So I think it would really need to sort of fit the community needs, and also sort of it's necessary to like really maybe combine different measures, so because you wouldn't find a measure that will solve all your problems. We also seen that while like on the national level, there's examples in Nepal, but also in our case in Vietnam, that there is already like a policies that combine like disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation and development, which is sort of an important enabling environment for realizing these additional dividends. But these are counteracted by like local skepticism and by local decision makers, mainly, and also the communities themselves, partly because of sort of like the political pressure after disaster, which a lot of these, unfortunately, these interventions are sort of implemented after disaster, which then sort of like really increases the pressure to especially like demonstrate that you can avoid losses, which sort of like then might not have that which keeps you away from like finding really solutions that in the long term can also help you generating additional or multiple dividends. There are higher perceived uncertainties on the materialization, because I think a lot of the like intervention we looked at were quite new and innovative solutions, and also the additional dividends did not necessarily always, like all the dividends did not necessarily meet all the needs of the communities. So there's a few but one thing that was like found as quite successful was that like sort of already implemented pilot project like really helped to overcome this skepticism, but these are unfortunately quite scarce at the moment, so like that really can demonstrate these benefits also in the long run. So there's like a few things that I would like to highlight into like finding like a suitable decision-making framework for the triple dividend of resilience. And one is sort of like they would need to cover the entire decision-making cycle. So not only sort of like the appraisal part, but also the monitoring and evaluation part. It would need to like systematically consider individual dividends, and also if they meet actually the community's needs. So to really like create a convincing narrative for in these communities, and also they would need to address and communicate these uncertainties around whether dividends materialize, and also I mean the timeframes of many of these measures are quite long, and sort of like this would need to be accompanied by that. And with that, I would like to close, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Victor. And now we have Tom Tanner. Go ahead, Tom. You're on mute.
I am just sharing my screen as well. There we go. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many people from so many parts of the world here. For the Americans here in particular, it might be a time to talk about feelings. But actually, I think my experience of COVID-19 has been really one of getting to grips with feelings about it, about feelings of anxiety, but also feelings of anger at different levels of response. But at the same time, there's lots of good that I've seen come out of the COVID response. So an example here in the UK, I think a lot of people were quite emotionally taken up with the clap for carers on the Thursday, everyone coming to their doorsteps, meeting neighbours and talking to neighbours in ways that they hadn't done before. And it really struck home just how important these kind of psychosocial issues are. Those being the kind of the social factors, the interrelationship between those social factors and individual ways of thinking and ways of behaving. So I'm increasingly interested in the concept of psychosocial benefits in the context of the triple dividends of resilience. And I think it stems from our understanding in our initial work that although that's quite an economic framing, that we do understand, and as you've seen from the examples that Emily and Victor have presented, that there is a strong political economy, that we have to think about how people understand the problem, how people feel, whether they feel things are being delivered or not, as well as our more objective economic measurement. So that political economy kind of informs my increasing interest in these psychosocial elements. And I'll be very brief. We've seen them already, and we're interested in kind of collating more evidence around these and seeing if they can basically add to that burden of proof around what are the benefits of taking anticipatory action, resilience building, adaptive actions that think about the longer term changes in climate shocks and stresses in particular, but also now in the context of these complex risks and threats, such as we're seeing with COVID being combined with climate related hazards. So I'm putting them in two baskets for the moment, but we're certainly there, as you've seen from some of the results there from Emily and Victor, there is a sense that collectively taking action, building community resilience, however you define community, but collective action has a huge benefit. And we've seen this reported elsewhere as well. I'm working particularly on this, trying to get empirical data around the benefits to youth groups, young people's groups working on climate and climate action, and seeing the actually taking action and coming together and discussing and debating and deciding what to do, whether to advocate, whether to try and take more concrete actions themselves, has a benefit in itself. It's staving off the sense of anxiety, of helplessness, and that isn't being captured at the moment in the way we're thinking about benefits. So I'm interested in that also through the city partnerships that we've seen emerging in the last decade, and something else I'm involved with, which is the university networks, the university and college networks around climate action, and the extent to which actually working with other unis and colleges has helped galvanize our approach and helped spur people on and give them a sense of being part of a bigger picture. So the Race to Zero and the university networks signing up to the Race to Zero in the run up to the COP next year is an example of that, and actually doing that together rather than just feeling like this is just me and these are my problems and we can't get to zero at my uni and that's really frustrating. But actually to say, how has being part of that wider network enhanced your own feelings, your own psychosocial well-being, but also your behaviors and those social relationships influencing those behaviors. The second, and where we do have some useful empirical data emerging, is around the reduced stress and anxiety related to resilience investments and their actions. Emily and I are involved in some of the work that the Red Cross has been pioneering around forecast-based finance. So using forecasts to set out protocols that mean that aid, social protection, cash dispersals can be delivered before a disaster actually strikes, or at very least, just after it has, instead of going through the usual protocols and having to wait weeks until that assistance arrives. So one of the interesting things that the Red Cross group, where I was working in Bangladesh, we looked at the evaluations there, and I was really fascinated by one of the areas that they looked into was the reduced emotional stress. So by having something anticipatory in place, they asked what was the frequency of people having felt depressed or anxious in the last 7 days. And what they found was that there's a marked, statistically significant difference between those who are in the control group and those who are in the intervention areas. So here on the diagram, you have a much greater number of people who reported never having felt depressed or anxious in the last 7 days. And the attribution is to having these systems in place that they know that the assistance, the cash assistance, will be with them much faster when they're using the forecast-based approach than waiting for the normal conventional means, which involve the local level assessments before any payouts are made, and the difficulty of accessing money locally and that sort of thing. So we're starting to see some of this empirical evidence. I think it's a really interesting area. It's always tough to convince the economists on, who necessarily say, well, if you can convert this into hard cash, then that's easier. But actually, I think we need to really understand better these interrelationships between those social factors around resilience building and individual behavior and feelings. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tom. And now we have a presentation from Uli. Please take it away.
Hi, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me and you can also see the slides. So I will turn from the psychosocial dividends to macro financial dividends. And my main point is that investing in resilience, strengthening resilience, is actually a good investment also from a macro financial perspective. So we've done some work looking at the impact of climate change and climate vulnerability on the cost of capital in climate vulnerable countries. And we could show empirically that governments of climate vulnerable countries have to pay a higher cost on their sovereign debt, which is problematic because these are actually the countries that have the greatest investment needs in adaptation and resilience, but they're also facing a climate vulnerability premium on their cost of debt, which is limiting their space, ability to invest resilience. And this is a big problem because with climate change getting worse, with financial markets increasingly taking note of climate risk, the chances are that the cost of capital are going to increase further. So there's a risk of a vicious circle where countries have to pay, climate vulnerable countries have to pay ever higher debt and have ever less fiscal room. And this is, of course, a big problem because it holds back general economic development, but it also hinders crucial investment in adaptation. Now, the higher cost of capital also translates to the private sector. So in a separate study, we could show that firms, so using firm level data, firms in climate vulnerable countries actually also have to pay higher cost capital, so also they will be constrained in the development. So this is a really serious problem. And so kind of the research was part of a UN project on climate change and cost of capital. And we've just 2 weeks ago or so launched a new report looking at the link between climate change and sovereign risk, where we could show that different channels, through different channels, physical and transition risks of climate change can drive up, can cause macro financial instability and drive up the cost of capital. So that is a really big problem. And let me just show you 2 charts from that recent report. You have on the left-hand side sovereign bond yields plotted against a measure of climate vulnerability, where you can see a positive relationship. And on the right-hand side, you have, again, sovereign bond yields. So as a measure of the cost of capital that governments have to pay, plotted against climate, a measure of climate resilience, where you can see a negative relationship. So clearly, countries that are more resilient have to pay lower cost of capital. And of course, we do kind of some empirical analysis to go beyond these. And so there is a very strong case for investing in resilience and also to design mechanisms that can help resilience. And I'm not going through all these different recommendations we make in this recent report, but we highlight that there is a very crucial role that central banks, financial supervisors, finance ministries have to play in this. And as you know, traditionally, these actors have not always been at the forefront of dealing with climate issues, but they have to be because it really will make a difference. And so in a nutshell, the argument is there is a very strong macro financial case for investing in resilience, and this is one of the co-benefits from in this triple dividend concept. Let me stop here and thank you.
Thanks very much, Uli. We broke up a little bit while you were speaking, but hopefully everyone got a sense of the main points that you were making. Let me hand it over now to Svenja, who's going to facilitate Q&A, and do please continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. And I see that some have gone into the chat. If you could copy them over into the Q&A, that would be really helpful. Thanks. Svenja.
Yeah, well, thank you to all the presenters for giving us some insights. And I guess now is the time to open this up and, you know, to sort of explore maybe this also in the context of your own experience, because I know we have on the call various colleagues who kind of day in, day out sort of grapple with the challenges also around quantifying resilience and tracking, you know, adaptation. So yeah, let's use the next sort of half an hour to explore this a bit more broadly. We have some questions raised in the Q&A set, so I'll suggest we start with that and then sort of work our way through that. So I guess given the number of people that we have on this call, I would recommend if you want to ask something, then write it into the Q&A, and I'll try and go through that list so that we can go through that. And to others, if you see a question where you feel you want to contribute or have an answer, then by all means start also adding some thoughts that you have yourself, so that we can have a bit of an interactive session here. So maybe just to begin with, I think there were a couple of questions also in the context of, the public economic case and the sort of policy side or the political economy that came up here. And, as I said in my initial chat, introductory words, that was really what drove the concept, to sort of create a tool that actually overcomes some of the well-known barriers in an political economy context, and we're probably all familiar with what these barriers are. And the question is, does the triple resilient dividend does the trick, and does it get us to a place where, you know, we are in a, yeah, we have the ammunition to address those questions when talking to Ministry of Finance, when making the case for those who are sort of seeking funding or investment opportunities. So I know that Simon Anderson and also Tom Downing, you kind of started a bit of a dialogue there. So can I call maybe on, yeah, let's start with Simon, because you raised this. Do you just want to maybe bring in your own experience here, because you were also referring to some of, you know, the earlier work in this field. Do you just want to come in in that? And I think, is it correct that you can unmute yourself, or how is it going to work?
David, you should be able to talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can talk, but I'm not sure this question is directed at me.
No, this was to Simon. Simon.
We just have to give it a second, Svenja, because they need to be given permission to speak.
Oh, I see. Okay, apologies. As you can see, well rehearsed.
There we go. Simon now has permission to speak.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. The first question I asked was really drawing a parallel between some work that was done quite some years ago now about how you might use pull mechanisms to stimulate investment in global public goods, which I see as kind of analogous to this work. And it was very much focused on getting private sector to invest in things that would achieve very large general welfare benefits. Unfortunately, the history of that was unsuccessful, and I think one of the reasons why it was unsuccessful was because there was a lack of understanding of how welfare outcomes could be used to stimulate private sector investments. And I can see that although the triple dividend approach takes things further in terms of disaggregating where the benefits are and therefore who the benefits might be, I think that there has to be more political economy analysis of those redistributive processes, and to understand those in terms of how incentive structures, both for public and private investment, can be supported.
Okay, well, thanks, Simon. Oli and Tom, do you want to quickly come in on that point?
Just come in because I was typing an answer, or typing a comment to Simon anyway. Yeah, I take that on board, Simon. There's this isn't perfect, but actually, one of the things that trying to segregate out these different benefits has helped is that in the projects we looked at when we did the initial report was to look at the distributional benefits, different types of benefit, and to whom they are beneficial, who bears the cost, who actually takes the benefits, and over what timescales, and actually pinning that down and kind of getting that level of detail was something that we weren't seeing in the standard cost benefit analysis, which, as you probably know, tend to take an example from wherever they can get it, and then say, well, our example is analogous to that, and we're using these bases, kind of business case, I mean, rather than the kind of detailed cost benefit analyses. But when you're looking at the business case for making investments and using fairly dirty data, actually being able to think about it in terms of disaggregating those benefits, to whom they go, and the timescales, that has greater potential to be able to address some of these distributional inequities, essentially. And at the extreme, if we see this as part of the problem is the investments aren't being made because of those distributional differences, then bringing them to the fore and allowing that debate and or resistance and protest to emerge about who bears the cost and who gets the benefits, and even just to have that debate between where government can make an intervention because it is should be provided as a public good, because the benefits are distributed such that the markets are unlikely to provide them, or at least work out what incentives might be needed. So I think it's partly that, providing that level of information around the distribution of those costs and benefits that can improve things, notwithstanding, as you say, that there are existing political economy there, and we need to understand what the incentive structures are over things that aren't just about economics.
I must admit, I missed the question because I was trying to answer questions in the chat. So sorry for that. But if you have a kind of 10-second summary of the question, I can give an answer or try.
Well, this was about redistributive impacts and, using the concept really to change the political economy that sort of hampers investment in resilience. And, saying that a lot of that will have, imply redistribution, and, it's usually not seen as really urgent or necessary.
Okay, yeah, actually, it is a very brilliant question and a very important one. So I'm actually right now working on a study with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, where we are connecting the dots between kind of the financial inclusion agenda, which is focused on, how can we support more vulnerable people through finance, and the green or sustainable finance agenda, which is really more about how can we boost investment in sustainability and so on. And so the connections are very clear and very strong, I think. It's obvious that climate change is disproportionately affecting the bottom of the economic pyramid, so the more vulnerable people. And at the same time, it's also pretty clear that from a political economy perspective, we will not be succeeding in any kind of low carbon transition if it's not just. And so I think this concept of a just transition basically has to guide everything we do in the climate space, and not only regarding mitigation, but also adaptation. And so I think the triple dividend concept in this context is really important, because we need to show the benefits and co-benefits of adaptation investment for the most vulnerable people. And distribution has to be part of that story, but also very importantly, empowering people, including through access to finance. And I'm not saying that access to finance will be kind of the single answer to all of that, but we need different layers of policy responses that really will empower people. But distribution has to be part of that for sure.
Okay, thanks. Emily, I believe you also wanted to briefly comment on this.
Yeah, thanks, Fenya. I mean, I think it's a really interesting point, and partly comes down to kind of where the challenge is coming from to prioritize resilience or investments that will protect assets and people and the economy from these shocks. And sometimes it's not that government is kind of monolithic and pushing back as a whole. Actually, a lot of the interest in the triple dividend has come from disaster risk managers and disaster management agencies who want to make the case more strongly within their governments for prioritizing work that's sort of relegated to them as sort of single agencies to address, and to come up with policies and investments that can kind of have a sort of mutual interest between the disaster management and other sectoral ministries. So that it's been quite interesting having discussions about the triple dividend with those agencies as well, and helping them to have discussions with line ministries around investments that can be beneficial for agriculture and productivity, and reduce disaster risk, or looking for the co-benefits that can help more than one government department to achieve their objectives, and having a kind of overarching resilience agenda behind this really helps to push it along. And I've been working quite closely with the government of Dominica on developing their resilience policy, and now looking to implement and thinking about which investments are priorities. And certainly using this kind of framework helps departments to kind of work together on parts of the agenda. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Before we move on to the topic of measuring resilience, which also came up in the question and answer, I just wanted to give Tom Downing a chance to maybe come in with your experience, because I noticed you also wrote a comment on the question and answer session. Tom, do you want to come in and say something about your own experience? If that doesn't work, then Tom, are you there?
I'm now unmuted.
Oh, okay. Sorry for calling up on you, but I thought you might want to share some of your thoughts on this.
Well, the 2 or 3 thoughts that come from our practice. One is we're doing a reappraisal, a revisit, I don't know, new version of the climate safeguard system for the African Development Bank. And the thing that strikes us over and over again is a system that's used is useful. And a system that's overly prescribed from the Paris Agreement, building blocks, or whatever current fashionable list is, doesn't actually do very much for transforming Africa. So you need to start from a practical, deep understanding of institution policy and behavior rather than some nice theory. And we have lots of nice theory. We are champions of various nice theories over the years. The second part of that then is not to dodge the political economy, but to embed that in the procedures that are compulsory, or at least point people in the right direction. And the one we've been using are business process models, but they're market driver frameworks. There are others that force the market to understand what is the barrier. And it's not the amount of money or the willingness to spend the money, it's something else in the system. And then the last piece was just, when you're measuring resilience, it doesn't have a generic property. It is always contextual. So somehow you need to capture the context in a very practical way. And I fear that the triple dividends actually simplify too much and impose too much of an external framing to what would be quite a contested space within the institutions we've worked in. But interesting, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Tom. I mean, you mentioned measuring resilience, and in a way, this is at the core of basically all the concepts that are flying around is, you know, how do you measure resilience and how you also track resilience? And, you know, as we all know, you know, there are different approaches to this. And, you know, it would be good to get different views and experiences from across the community that's in the call here. Maybe to begin with, it would be great if I can call on my colleague David Nash, who's been working on this, you know, for a long time, and actually was also part of developing a resilience measurement framework that's now being used in the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. So David, do you want to say a few words about your experience with measuring resilience?
Sure. Thanks, Svenja. Just to kind of put a little context in this, the challenge that the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance tried to address when we first started out was this whole idea that we needed to try and demonstrate that we had been successful in building community resilience to flooding. It was a very, very specific, targeted kind of approach, and recognized that what we were trying to do was get ahead of the curve when it came to dealing with natural hazard related disasters. And so we needed to find something that enabled us to measure it in the absence of a disaster. And so a lot of thinking from our research partners and our community partners on the ground kind of brought together this two kind of resilience related models, which we've kind of evolved into a practical tool on the ground. The first one was developed by University in Buffalo, New York, called the Multidisciplinary Center for Earthquake Engineering Research. This organization brought out their ideas around the 4R properties of resilience. So if you're looking at a system, in any kind of system, it would exhibit these 4R resilience properties if it was able to deal with the hazard that was striking it. From there, the question then asked is, so how do systems acquire these properties? And that's where we then looked at the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework as being able to kind of look at the assets that a community has at its disposal and think about how they are deployed and how they are built and developed and managed to enable them to create these resilient properties within the community. So if you've got this idea that you've got a system which is a community, you've got a systems level analysis of the kind of assets they have, what they have at their disposal, how they've built them, how they're maintaining them, how they're using them, and how they can be developed, then you can see the contribution towards a resilient property. And then the leap is to say, how does that actually provide resilience, for which you then need ex post data to be able to verify that there is this kind of link. But the intention being that we measure these contributions from a variety of different assets in the belief that they provide the properties that you require to do resilience working. We've built that into a practical tool on the ground, so developed a whole series of data gathering questions and survey kits and individual interviews and all that kind of stuff to have a look at what quality of assets the community has. We've got a whole analysis basis which is coming out of the way in which Zurich, the insurance company, looks at risk. So when we send our risk engineers in to talk to large global customers, looking at their plants, for example, we look at the factors that contribute to the risk and how they what kind of quality those things are. We take that principle into looking at the quality of the data we're raising around our assets, and from that, by looking at that through a variety of different lenses, looking for connections through this system, what we believe we are able to do is to pinpoint areas where strengths can be used to overcome weaknesses, and the overall picture for that community in terms of its development, its ability to be able to strive and thrive and move forward is enhanced. Obviously, if they are then hit by a flood, we then have an opportunity of being able to test that assumption, and a lot of the work that our colleagues in IASA are doing is looking at that analysis between the actual outcome and our predicted outcomes, to be able to demonstrate that we can literally measure resilience to flooding in a community at a community level before an event happens, and even in the absence of an event. We've been doing that now since 2014, so the last 5 or 6 years. Data sets are growing, and hopefully in the next 2 or 3 years we will have a complete data set to demonstrate how this can be done.
Okay, well, many thanks, David, for this. Can I just sort of bring in from my own perspective, you know, this notion, you know, there are a variety of indicators out there that help to understand resilience, and you know, we've been playing around and work with those, but let's not forget that also resilience is a very subjective concept. And you know, we've done some work around, you know, subjective resilience measures when it comes to understand what the impact of insurance is, for example. So you know, you can sort of through surveys also get information about how people experience, you know, their own resilience and how they actually value the impact that interventions such as insurance or such as an infrastructure investment have on their own resilience. And I think, this might often be dismissed as, well, this is too subjective, too qualitative, and, we can't really use this for anything. I would be, very, very careful about dismissing it, because particularly when you try and influence resilience at a local community level, I mean, this is basically what you're trying to influence, and what you need to understand is how people perceive and experience, these interventions. So that's an important aspect to keep in mind. I'm conscious of time, and I just want to bring in one question that was raised from a colleague about the African Development Bank and the work on adaptation benefit mechanisms, and the exploring how they can be linked. The colleague who posted that question, it's Kai Kim Chiang, if I pronounce it correctly. Would you like to briefly say something about this? Because I guess that could be quite an interesting question to pick up, with some of the colleagues on the call.
Yes, I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, it's fine. Perfect.
Yeah, so I was actually just sitting into a small introduction discussion just before this event, where I learned about this adaptation benefits mechanism that is being developed with support from the African Development Bank in it. And so it's supposed to be a mechanism that it works in a similar way to the CDM, and it's being sort of developed under track 6.8 under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I was just wondering if this was something that was on your radar, and if it's a mechanism that's been put in place to try and increase private sector investments into adaptation. So I was just wondering if there's been any engagement between the group of people that are developing the triple dividends mechanism and this adaptation benefits mechanism.
Okay, well, many thanks. And I can only say yes. I mean, this is very much, the mindset that we're having, and to try and apply it to that. Could I call on Carter, Brendan, because this is squarely obviously in your area where you're working on, and would you like to comment on that, and maybe also some other observations?
Sure. Hi. No, I'm not terribly familiar with the African Development Bank, but I can completely agree with all the comments about metrics, both that it's urgent and it's subjective and it's complicated and it's political. I just think that there's efforts. I mean, I'm most knowledgeable on sort of ecological environmental benefits rather than social benefits. It's more my field, but there are huge amounts of efforts going into good modeling, both physical modeling and economic valuation of those benefits that is, I think, super helpful. My more general takeaway from this, I just want to mention that linking to the political economy, I agree with Tom when he was saying that information is good, information facilitates. Of course, information itself doesn't change anything, but it's a question of is it packaged in a way that can be as useful as possible with the right users and beneficiaries of that information. So I'd like to just basically say we've talked about different models of triple dividends, everything from local Bio-dykes, sort of green versus gray infrastructure in Nepal, all the way up to sovereign risk. And this is not one thing. These are very different issues, audiences, levels of analysis. But the triple dividends is a framework that allows you to just be sure that you've addressed all the possible implications of the proposed action. So I would like to emphasize that it is a framework, and it helps you remember, oh, have I checked for social benefits? Have I checked for environmental? Have I checked for
labor impacts? Have I looked at trade? Have I looked at sovereign risk? Have I looked at timeframes? Have I looked at uncertainty? And it really raises questions more than answers them. It's not a cookbook, but I think as a systematic approach, because it's consistent, builds on cost-benefit tradition, that's where the value really lies. Thanks.
Okay, Carter, many thanks for that. And just echoing this, in our work here in England with the city and Lowestoft and Felixstowe, that is exactly the way that they've been using this. And, you know, also basically open it up to, have we considered this, and which areas have we looked at when we make resilience decisions? Well, thank you all for your questions and comments and responses. I now would like to hand over to Suzanne from SouthSouthNorth to close our session. Suzanne, would you like to join?
Thanks very much, Svenja. So I'm just representing the from SouthSouthNorth side. We were the project that financed the WISER Transform project, or we were funded by the Met Office, but we implemented the WISER Transform project, which Emily shared the results of, one of the parts of our work. And I'd just like to say, you know, we're very excited that of all the ideas that have been shared today, that just the WISER portion of it is a small component, but I think that there's a lot of interest and excitement about this particular framework, the TDR. And we'd just really like to encourage people to continue to engage on it, to share their experiences of using it. And hopefully that collective experience and sharing will generate a lot more value in understanding what the real benefits are of investing in these kinds of weather and climate services, in the case of WISER, but in other sectors as well, as some of the other panelists touched on. So just to say that all of the presentations and the recording of the session and all of that sort of thing will be shared with you next week. And we really hope that you share the content with others you think that might find it interesting. And I'm wishing you all a very good afternoon or evening, depending where you are in the world, and hope that you join us again for another webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
So.